Hi, my name is Krishna Bhamidipati, and this is my APUSH final slideshow project. So the question I'm addressing is how the U.S. economy changed domestically/internationally over time from 1776, which was the formal year that the U.S. gained independence, to 2021, which is today. So as of 3 p.m. of June 3rd, 2021, the U.S. national debt is about $28.36 trillion. This is a huge amount, and this presentation will talk about what led to this amount of debt to accrue, how the U.S. economy improved and at points failed over the history of its development. So the first major thing that happened in the U.S. economy was the creation of a national bank. Alexander Hamilton, a prominent Federalist, created the first national bank in order to take on the state's debt, which was accrued as a result of the Revolutionary War, and establish a system of federal control over the economy. This is a pretty smart move because after the Revolutionary War, a lot of states were sitting in piles of debt, and in order to establish the powers of the central government or the federal government, the creation of the national bank, they would take up all these debts for themselves, and they would allow the states to function more efficiently. So basically, as you can see, this is a picture of the first bank, by the way, but over here is the United States export chart from 1800 to 1812. So you can see it's steadily increasing, but then it's decreasing in this period. This is because of a war between Britain and France. Britain and France do tend to go to war a lot, and when they go to war, the U.S. they were on good relations with the population is mixed on what relation they should keep between Britain and France. So basically, what will happen is that as a result of these, Britain and France could be considered pretty powerful countries. So as a result of war between them, U.S. exports would decrease during the time period, but then steadily increased. But then, as you can see, around 1807, T.J. or Thomas Jefferson, he put the Embargo Act. This basically barred trade with foreign nations, and as you can see, this really plummeted the exports we were taking out. So basically, up until the War of 1812, it was really bad for the economy because the U.S. was a rather new country, and what was happening was that since they couldn't engage in as much trade as they could due to acts like the Embargo Act barring them from committing trade, this basically led the north of the U.S., the northern regions, they had they were pretty good with shipbuilding, so this basically led to them engaging in illegal trade, and then illegal trade, it's considered part of the shadow economy, so anything they did actually wouldn't be considered in our economy because it wasn't regulated. So it was really a bad time for the U.S. economically speaking, because they were not able to trade as much as they could, and they were producing a lot domestically, but at the same time, in a perfectly competitive market, what you'll see is that if there are more products, the price will end up going down, and then more of the same products. If you're only buying from a domestic thing, it's bad in terms of competition because you're being limited by what you can buy. But if you have a foreign market, you have more options to buy things, and then this leads to more trade, and then more trade is very beneficial to an economy. Next up is internal improvements plus sectionalism. So during the War of 1812 time period up until 1848, we would see something called internal improvements, and then the rise of something called sectionalism. So under Henry Clay's American system, the U.S. began to focus more on internally improving infrastructure. So as you can see this graph over here, this shows the creation of canals and roads, which really improved travel times of horses and oxen and steamships, and made trade more profitable and more efficient too, leading to more goods being purchased, and it did increase trade. However, if you look at this graph, you can also notice another thing. The canals, they tended to be sequestered more in the north, and then the south just had roads. So this ties back to the concept of sectionalism. So sectionalism was basically where a region would specialize. It basically means that the U.S. would be split into sections. The most common sections are the north and the south, and then these regions would specialize in different areas, and then their economies would grow over a certain concept. So in the north would tend to focus more on industrial development. The south would focus on agriculture. So as you can see here, this is a factory. The north was an industrial powerhouse, so they would be focusing a lot on manufacturing. For the south, there was crops like cotton. These were deemed cash crops because they were very profitable. European countries were they demanded these in high demand. Inventions like the cotton gin just made more cotton be able to be flushed out from cotton farms. So basically, While sectionalism did have its pros, like it did specialize certain regions of for the regions they were more profitable in. Like the north wasn't that good with farming because their land wasn't that arable, but the south had better land equipped for farming, so that was a pro. But a con of sectionalism that's not economics based is that it did lead to heightened tensions between the regions and the politicians because they were competing for funding. And what this did lead to is, while it didn't directly lead to the Civil War, its conflict did lead to the Civil War. So yeah, I would say overall though, internal improvements in sectionalism did improve the U.S. economy, and then we would see internal improvements that are still a large part of U.S. society today. Infrastructure is very vital to maintaining a good economy, and we will see that as we progress through the presentation. Next thing I want to talk about is the Jacksonian era. The Jacksonian era took place in the middle of the last slide. Basically what the Jacksonian era entailed, so Andrew Jackson, very controversial president. A lot of people have mixed views on him. I personally don't like him, but if I do have to say something, he's probably one of the best presidents in terms of economics, from an economic standpoint, because he got us out of our cycle of national debt, and yeah, that was basically one of the main reasons. But to get out of the cycle of debt, what Jackson would do is he would place high tariffs on foreign goods. A tariff is just a fancy word for a tax on another good. So when you put a tax on something, you're basically consumers have to pay more, and then and what this does is it doesn't incentivize them to buy as many of these goods because they have to pay more money to get it. So they would focus more on domestic goods. Jackson was a man of the people. He really preferred the idea of an agrarian economy. So you could say that placing these high tariffs were in line with his character, and it did help. Like, while you would think a high tariff is like bad for the economy, but in this case it ended up helping, and it made the U.S. more focused on itself and buying domestically. Also, Jackson, something to note is he didn't really like the idea of a national banks, and he used something called pet banks instead. So Jackson vetoed a charter for a bank because the bank charters only lasted 20 years, so he didn't create a second national bank, and he used something called pet banks instead. So pet banks were just small like state banks, and then basically they got the name pet because Jackson was a believer in the proponent of the spoils system, which we would see in his presidency. So what the spoils system was basically supporters and like people that supported Jackson would get claims to these banks, and then these banks would run under that. So at the height, I think there were about 23 pet banks, and then yeah, while these pet banks didn't lead to a problem during the Jacksonian era for the economy, it would lead to a minor recession and or depression under the President Van Buren, which was really bad for the economy because these pet banks, they would when they were printing money, it tended to be very inflated, and it wasn't backed by like the coins or like the silver or the precious metals that backed up currency wouldn't work. So the dollars they would print were pretty worthless, and this like currency shortage like would lead to the depression under President Van Buren. Next thing I want to talk about is the Gilded Age. So the Gilded Age occurred slightly after the Civil War. Basically, the Gilded Age was very prominent. So basically what was happening is political machines became prominent, and then they would control the funding in various parts of cities' economies because they had the votes of the people. So I would say the political machines, like, they kind of tainted the economy and made the economy weaker because while they did make some improvements to the cities they were in, they were basically funneling away the money for themselves, and then this basically was very bad for the economy because this money would be used for their own personal need. Also, what happened during the Gilded Age was we saw a surplus in crop production. So since there were more crops being grown and the demand for crops stayed constant, what happened was that the price for these crops went down like severely, and then farmers would go into perpetual cycles of debt because they just couldn't afford to live on the land based on what they were selling with. So why did this perpetual cycle of debt for these farmers, why did it happen? Well, the reason for this was during this time period, monopolies started to rise. So what a monopoly is a monopoly is a type of imperfect competition. It's one firm. One firm controls everything. So when there's one firm, there's no competition going in the economy, and then they basically fix the prices and in the economy, and if you can't afford it, you can't go it, but if you can afford it, you don't have any choice. You don't have like any consumer choice to switch to another firm. So you have to go with whatever price they were doing. And what monopolies would do in the case of railroads, so they would do something called price gauging. So price gauging was they would jack up the prices of these railroad lines, and then the farmers would have to pay these rates because A, there were no other lines in the area they were in, and they would have to transfer these crops. So these expensive rates, in addition to the low prices of the farmers, led to pretty bad economic conditions for them. And then, as I mentioned before, farmers went into a perpetual cycle of debt. Because of these debt cycles, farmers advocated for bimetallism. What bimetallism was, as you can see in this image over here, there's gold and there's silver. So at the time, the U.S. currency was backed by a gold standard, but then proponents of bimetallism argued that currency should also be backed by silver. Reason being for this was that silver was being mined in pretty large quantities at the time, and then what this would do is it would inflate the value of the U.S. dollar, and then inflated dollars, the farmers could use that inflated money to pay out these debts, and then yeah, but bimetallism it actually would never pass, but it did pave the way for other reforms, because bimetallism did lead to a party known as the Populist Party to form, and then these parties, this was a very prominent third party, and it would be known more in the progressive era for the reforms they would carry out, which, while they weren't carried out under the name of the party, the Populist Party, these ideas were taken up by the progressives. Overall, I would say the Gilded Age for the economy, it did have its, I would say it had more cons than it was pros. It was really gilded. It looked good on the surface, but it was not that great, because a lot of people, they were living in debt, like most of the farmers, and then the consolidation of wealth was put in the hands of wealthy, as you can see, political machines and monopolies. Next, I'm talking about the progressive era. So the progressive era is it was a deviation from laissez-faire economics. That's one of the main proponents of the progressive era. So laissez-faire, what that means is laissez-faire is very hands-off. So what this means is that there's very little regulation, and businesses can do as they please, and governments will have very minimal regulation in what they can say. Progressive era changed this, and then they adopted a non-laissez-faire economics model. So what they did is they addressed many of the monopolies that were built up post-Civil War in the Gilded Age, and then they enforced many reforms through trust busting, which broke up monopolies. Then consumer products saw more regulation. So basically what the progressive era did is, for the consumer, it did make buying products for the consumer much better, because they were guaranteeing safety with some projects. If you know the Meat Inspection Act, that was a result of Upton Sinclair. He was a prominent market wrecker. He found a lot of problems with the Chicago meatpacking industry, so regulation of consumer products actually made it safer for them to eat. So what this did for the economy was, you could argue that it was detrimental to the economy, but I beg to differ, because what the progressive era did is it increased the trust in what people were buying. When you increase trust, you're increasing consumer confidence, and what that does is it increases the demand for products. And an increase in demand is always beneficial, because consumers will be buying more and more. So I would say this did help improve the economy, and basically, as I said in the last slide, the power of wealth was consolidated in the hands of the few. While this consolidation of wealth still remained, basically the progressive era made it more ethical for people to buy products. Alright, next up is the Great Depression. The Great Depression was probably one of the biggest failures in United States economic history. The reason for this was, it was caused by speculative spending in the Roaring '20s. What is speculative spending, you ask? So speculative spending is basically spending on credit. When you spend on credit, what you're basically doing is you're deferring a payment to a later date, and you're just buying the product knowing that you'll pay for it later. So you're basically buying something on collateral. You're saying that I'll pay for it later. But basically, what a lot of people were buying things on credit during this time period. And basically what this did is, while during the time period until the very end, it didn't show, money was there was a lot of fake money, the sense of money was inflated. There was a lot of fake money in the sense that it didn't exist. The money just didn't exist because people weren't paying it normally. So basically the speculative spending, even investors would buy stocks on speculative spending. What this did was, investors in 1929, close to the stock market crash, they suddenly were selling their shares out of panic. A lot of people were doing the same thing. Basically, a lot of people were trying to cash out their money, and then the banks, they just didn't have this money, because a lot of people were buying things on credit, and then this led to a low circulation of money in the economy. And then basically, this led to the Great Depression to occur. So the Great Depression was a temporary problem, but it was fixed by the U.S. government. So what they did is they stepped in with the New Deal, which increased transfer payments through the form of Social Security. They created the Social Security Act, Also, what a transfer payment is basically you're giving a payment to elderly people, disabled people, a monthly pension, which comes out of current people working their paychecks. And you and I are all entitled to Social Security once we hit a certain age, but we will have to that money will be deducted out of our paychecks until we hit that age. So basically, unemployment during this time was at its highest point. It hit around 24.9%. Basically, a quarter of the country was unemployed. And basically, in order to combat this, the U.S. They created several agencies. So the Tennessee Valley Agency, the TVA, CCC, Works Progress Administration, many other things were created. The Civilian Conservation Corps. So basically, what these agencies did. So I brought up the concept of infrastructure before. These agencies, what they were designed around, were improving the infrastructure of the economy. So while the U.S. was still in a depression, while they were still building and improving this infrastructure, these agencies really helped the economy in a two-pronged approach. What they were doing is they were improving overall productivity because they were hiring more workers. When you're hiring more workers, what that's naturally going to do is it's going to bring down the unemployment rate, which is a good thing. At the same time, what was cool is that they were focused on improving infrastructure. Infrastructure is a major component of GDP, and GDP is usually a good indicator of economic growth. So they were trying to improve the U.S. economy by focusing on infrastructure. A lot of dams, roads, and canals, same concept things, highways, all built during this time period. Basically, while unemployment wasn't fully fixed, unemployment will always exist in the society because there will always be frictional and structural employment, which are natural forms of employment. Cyclical unemployment was going down drastically. Cyclical unemployment is just unemployment that comes as a result of depressions and recessions. So actually a perfect when people say an economy is at full employment, it means there's zero cyclical unemployment. So the unemployment that's only persisting is unemployment that can't be fixed. So the Great Depression really was a terrible time for the U.S. economy, but what we saw is that the U.S. was able to get out of it due to policies under FDR. While some critics of FDR did say that his policies were borderline socialism, I do say that FDR's policies, they worked. They were able to restore consumer confidence, and also we were able to see banks become more prominent again, because a prominent thing of FDR was the FDIC. So what the FDIC did is that it federally insured banks that they could up to $250,000 if a bank was to shut down. Because when banks shut down at the beginning of this Great Depression, they weren't federally backed. So what that means is that if a bank was to shut down and you had money in it, you would lose that money, and this was terrible for consumers, and it was very bad. But this was a step that the U.S. took to improve their look on the economy, and they improved it by bolstering their infrastructure and doing a lot of other things. Some of these things is World War II. It helped the U.S. out of the Depression. One of these pictures is the Lend-Lease Act. The Lend-Lease Act basically increased it allowed the U.S. to sell arms to allied countries. So we would sell arms to Britain, and then basically that just increased productivity further, and it really helped bring the U.S. out of the Great Depression. Next thing I want to talk about is post-World War II. So post-World War II, what it did for the economy is there was an increase in consumer spending, and there was a baby boom which stimulated the economy. These people here are from the age, they're baby boomers. They were a result, a lot of more kids were born during this time because there was an increase in consumer spending. So the fear after World War II is that there was going to be a displacement for the soldiers because there was not enough jobs to keep up, but actually the opposite occurred. The U.S. countered by putting things like the GI Bill, which gave them free college education, and a more educated population would seek more jobs. They would tend to get more employed, and then they would get higher paying jobs, and then this led to an increase in consumer spending. So this picture over here, it shows suburban neighborhoods. So neighborhoods became really prominent during this time. A lot of people were buying houses. Then also, they wanted to enjoy things. So an increase in consumer spending, they would also they would indulge in other things like televisions, food, movies. They would buy more of these products, and then this was just increasing the consumer spending. So basically, post World War II, what a lot of economists thought would be a horrible economic period for the U.S. actually tended to be the opposite. They were able to hold on and actually improve because the government stepped in with things like the GI Bill, which improved the education and subsidized education for veterans, and also the baby boom and an increase in consumer spending stimulated the economy because more people were spending because they had a big reason to, they had a new family. So the economy was stimulated during this time period. All right, now we come to why did the debt, so I mentioned earlier the U.S. national debt is about 28.6 trillion, right? Why is that? Well, answer to that lies in Reaganomics. Reaganomics is just a term for President Reagan, his belief in what he thought the economy should do. He believed in less regulation, so a more laissez-faire approach to. Believed in a more laissez-faire approach to economics. So he reduced a lot of taxes, but also bolstered or increased government spending. So this graph over here is it ties in aggregate demand and aggregate supply. So what Reagan was basically doing was something called crowding out. So what crowding out is when you're reducing taxes and increasing government spending are examples of fiscal policy. And crowding out is a direct result of fiscal policy because when you're increasing government spending, you're buying from industries that are going to help you. Like for example, Boeing. Boeing is an airline industry. If the U.S. wanted to make if they wanted to make airplanes for their Air Force, they would contract Boeing to do it, and then Boeing would use that money and they would buy other things. And what this would do is it would lead to a perpetual increase in aggregate demand, leading to a crowding out. So aggregate demand, what it basically measures is it measures price level and real GDP. So while an increase in aggregate demand, as you can see, it is increasing the output, what people tend to forget is that price level. What is price level exactly? So a higher price level basically means that the value of the dollar that you hold, it decreases in value. So what this does is that you're producing a lot more, which is good, but the price level for it, it's very inflated, so you're not actually getting a lot of money out of it. So this led to a huge trade deficit to increase because the U.S. they're buying a lot of things. They were importing more than they're exporting, and this just continually led to increase our trade deficit. So the national debt, it's not necessarily a bad thing that we're in, but you could contribute the sharp increase was mainly increase due to Reaganomics. Reaganomics at the time didn't seem like a bad thing, but I would argue that it was one of the worst things that happened in the U.S. economy, other than the Great Depression, because the Reaganomics, it just led to a large amount of inflation, and then the trade deficit is really big. Also, why the trade deficit increase was basically also an increased emphasis on national defense spending. So, national defense spending, believe it or not, it's very expensive. It's very important because of guns and butter. It's good to have a good defense, but national defense tends to be very expensive. So it really increased government spending, really increasing crowding out, and basically really increasing the debt we face. But debt isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it's not a good thing either. I tend to say that national debt, like the U.S., it is a first world country, so we will tend to import more than we export. That is not a bad thing per se, but the thing is, when policies like this are implemented, what it does is that it falsifies the sense of money. It really weakens its purchasing power because of a higher price level. So I do feel that Reaganomics, it does have its pros and a fair share of pros and cons. So overall, I would say the U.S., they changed a lot overall from 1776 to 2021. So basically, what I noticed is that at the beginning, the U.S. tended to be more focused on trading themselves. They were more like a domestic economy. Because of acts like the Embargo Act, they would focus more on themselves and internal improvements. So improvements on infrastructure would stay pretty consistent. They would that's still there today, but the U.S. became more of an international nation, of an international trading nation, when it became an imperialist nation in the 1900s. And from then on out, the U.S. They've been engaged in a lot of trade, and then trade is very good for an economy because the U.S. interacts with a lot of countries. We're a part of NAFTA. There are a lot of things the U.S. is doing. But I will say that while trade is good, the United States should take a more levied approach when focusing on economics, because economics is it's a study of scarcity. We have limited resources and we have unlimited wants. So we have to allocate our time and output and a lot of resources efficiently. So overall, I do feel that the U.S. economy, it's in a much better place today because we're we're more on an international playing level, but at the same time, you can argue that we have a very high national debt. It's going to keep on increasing. We're running a huge trade deficit. So I will say that a solution I propose is that the United States, what they should do is they should increase taxes, and then they should also decrease government spending. The opposite of what Reaganomics is. What this will do is this will, if you can see that this is the multiplier effect for aggregate demand. This will basically be a reverse thing. It'll reduce the amount of output, and reduce the inflation we're doing. This may seem bad, but if we really want to address our trade deficit, I do feel this strategy would work. But I will say I really enjoyed this presentation. It was a great look at U.S. history. I really enjoyed the class. Thank you so much, Ms. Branquist. Have a great year, and I hope you have a good summer. See you next year.